this in this particular meetup. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, so my name is Apurva Samanta, and good morning to everyone. I welcome you all to the UiPath Kolkata Community Meetup on the topic Enhanced REFramework. Today we have our speaker as Dibyajyoti Shina, who is the solution architect in UiPath itself. Okay, so I would like to request all of you to please go on mute if you have any question during the particular session. So please raise your hand, or you can write the question in the chat box as well. Okay, so and there will be as Rohit mentioned, so there will be a dedicated part of this particular meetup, and which will be the Q&A, and the speaker will be having the having those questions on the last of this meetup. So we have divided this meetup on few base things, like we will be first going through the basics of RE framework, then we'll be checking all the things in enhanced RE framework, then we'll be having a demo, and then we'll be having the Q&A session. And during the whole meetup, this session, so I'll be there with a role of moderator. So please write anything and everything you require for this particular session, and I'll be taking care of that. So please feel free to speak if you require on the Q&A session, and please don't hide any question from the speaker. So hopefully we can get all the answers for all of your question. So hoping for the best for the particular session. And with this note, I would like to hand over this session to our speaker, Dibyajyoti Shina. Dibyajyoti, over to you.
Thank you, Apurva, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning. So hope you are doing fine on a weekend, that is Saturday morning. Thanks for joining the session early morning, right? So let me share my screen. Let me know if you are able to see my screen, okay?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, fine. So today we are going to discuss about Enhanced RE framework. And the agenda for today's session is basically we will be talking about the framework introduction. We will also understand the bits and pieces of RE framework. So if you have prior idea about RE framework, then it will really help. We will also understand where it lacked, the standard RE framework. As a result, we are going to use enhanced RE framework, and which scenarios we are going to use enhanced RE framework, right? Then we were going to jump into the enhanced RE framework overview, and we will do a comparative study between the architectures of RE framework versus enhanced RE framework. And we would also go through when do we use enhanced RE framework, right? And finally, the architecture of enhanced RE framework, like the layers of enhanced RE framework, the transaction flow, how that is happening, and the concept of work block. And also we will be talking about the features that enhanced RE framework is having over the standard RE framework, right? And lastly, we will also be talking about best practices, and then we will be jumping into the use case demo. So to start with, just a brief idea about framework, right? So as per Wikipedia, the framework is just a standard way of deploying your automation solution or any coding solutions, right? So it offers you a generic functionality to deploy any kind of automation solution, which you can tweak as per your wishes and as per your use cases, right? And you can also build some reusable components, and it basically offers the following key features like reusability, extensibility, and the structure, right? And this is the RE framework that you must be familiar with, right? So it contains 4 states: initialization block, get transaction data state, process transaction, and the end process state at the end, right? And entire architecture is based upon state machines. So you are having transitions or triggers for each of the particular states. So the idea is you are basically encapsulating each of the stages of your automation solution into blocks, right? So first one is the initialization, where you are basically initializing all your applications to be used in the process, doing the cleanup and prep operations, right? So once you do that, you are going to move into the get transaction data state, where you're basically fetching each of the transaction items from the orchestrator queue and processing the transaction. So once all the transactions are processed, you are basically going to move into the end process state, right? So this is the basic overview of RE framework. Now, where it lacked. So whenever we are deploying any use case with standard RE framework, we usually face that init state does not have any kind of retry mechanism, meaning if any kind of exception you are encountering in the init block, that does not get retried, right? So that is number one. Second one is the dispatcher and performer logic. So many a times you have to invoke your own workflow or build your own logic in order to integrate the dispatcher and performer into the standard RE framework. It does not offers any inbuilt capabilities, but yeah, you can build your dispatcher logic in the init state and the performer logic in the process transaction state, right? And the third one is the when you are going to process multiple line items corresponding to a single transaction item. Like let's say for an example, you are processing invoices, and in any kind of invoice, you have seen that it contains multiple line items, right? So your basically invoice file paths become your transaction item. Whereas if you enter the process transaction state, you have to iterate through each of the line items of that particular invoice in order to do the processing, right? So it does not offer any kind of standard way in order to iterate through the multiple line items for a particular transaction. Next one is the exception handling of individual subprocesses. So if you are having multiple subprocesses like SAP subprocess, Oracle subprocess, right? You have to integrate all of them into the process transaction state, and you have to build your own exception handling logic or retry mechanism logic in order to retry each of these processes. So same goes for the next point, that is the retry mechanism, and in case of exception is missing. The audit logging at sub-process level is also missing because you have to build your own logging mechanism and you have to write your own log message, right? So this is in brief where it lacked the standard RE framework, right? Now, before jumping into the enhanced RE framework, I would like to log in into the menti.com, or you can scan this QR code on your mobile phone. This is just to test the knowledge that you are having with the standard RE framework, right? So we will be just having a fun quiz session to know where we are regarding the standard RE framework implementation, right? Apurva, if you can just paste the code as well on the screen so that they can log into menti.com and type the code. You can type the code 4766923. And either ways, you can also scan the code, QR code on your mobile phone, and you can log into menti.com. Just give me a minute. Yeah. So let me start the first question. In which state do we invoke the dispatcher workflow in RE framework? You are having four options: init state, process transaction state, get transaction data state, and the end process state. You're having 7 seconds. The quickest one will be able to lead the board, okay? So we will be seeing the result at the end of the session. That's great. So 6 persons have responded correctly. Okay, we can see Mars leading the board and Vivekanandi the second place, Ajaswari as the third. Great. Let's move into the next question. So as I mentioned, you have to answer first in order to lead the board, okay? How many total states are present in RE framework? 4 options, 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? Now the countdown has begun, right? Okay, so almost majority of you have answered the right ones. but let's look at the leaderboard now. We can see Mars still leading, Vivekananda at the second place, Ajaswari as the third. Come on, guys. You have to change the leaderboard, right? Let's move into the third question, that is, to send an email with consolidated report of all the transactions, where should you invoke send email activity? 4 options: process transaction state, init state, end process state, and the get transaction data state. Great. So 6 persons have answered correctly, which is the end process state, right? That's great. Okay. Now Gayatri is at the second position, Gokul at the third, fourth Vivekananda, Mars still the fastest, right? That's great. Good going, Mars. Let's see what is the next question. In case of orchestrator queue, which retry number has the higher priority? One is config max retry number. Second one is the queue max retry number. All right, time is up. 9 persons have answered correctly, which is the queue max retry number. So in any kind of retry mechanism, if you are aware, config file, you have to pass 0 in order to retry that particular transaction, or if you are using queues, right? And queue max retry number will be the higher priority in that case. Now let's look at the leaderboard now. That's great. Gokul has come up to be the fastest now. Second one is Gayatri. Vivekananda is the third. I can see Mars going at the 4th position. Let us move into the next question. Now, if transaction item is data row, what will be the data type of transaction data? So you are having 4 options. Just keep in mind that multiple answers can get correct in this case, right? Okay. So one is array of data row, list of data row, queue item, and data row. Okay, that's great. So the correct answer is array of data row as well as the list of data row, right? So any kind of enumerable or collection of data row will be your transaction data in case of RE framework. Now let's look at the final leaderboard now. Okay, Gayatri is the leaderboard top scorer in this case. She is the fastest one to answer the correct questions, correct answers, right? Second is Vivekananda Acharya, third is Gokul. Congratulations, Gayatri. Right? So yeah, let's jump into the presentation now. Let me know if you are able to see my screen, right? I hope everyone is able to see my screen. Okay, great. So now we are moving on to the enhanced RE framework, right? So the overview of enhanced RE framework, this is the overall architecture of enhanced RE framework. So you are going to have one parent RE framework, which is going to invoke multiple child RE frameworks, right? So you can well imagine that any kind of sub-process you have, be it SAP or be it Oracle, right? If you are having multiple applications involved, in case of complicated logic, if you want to implement, right? You can leverage these child RE frameworks, and which is going to have its own retry mechanism and its own exception handling, right? And the entire architecture is based upon state machines. And this is the overall architecture, right? We will be going into the more details of this enhanced RE framework in the next slide. Okay. And this is side-by-side comparative study of RE framework versus the enhanced RE framework. Now, let me show you what are the differences, key differences we can identify from this overall architecture, right? As you can see, one is the error recovery of this init state, right? Which was missing earlier in the standard RE framework. So any kind of exceptions you are going to encounter in this initialization block, it is going to pass into the end process state. Similarly for the get transaction data and similarly for the process transaction data. Yeah, in case of process transaction data, we are traversing through the init block once again, and it is going to retry. But for the initialization state, this error recovery block was missing, or the error recovery mechanism was missing, the error recovery part and error abort part. So for each of these states, we are basically checking that if continuous max retry number is reached or not, and only then if it has not reached, then we are going into the error recovery part to retry the particular transaction. But else, if that number has got exceeded, it is going to the abort state, which is the end process state, right? So for each of these block, you can see the error recovery and error abort. And if any exception is encountered in the get set transaction data state, it is going into the data error, that is the end process state. Now, you won't be able to visualize the child RE frameworks over here. We will be going into the in-depth analysis of the enhanced RE framework now, where we are going to see those details, right? But this is the overall architecture or the parent enhanced RE framework that you are seeing over here, right? Which is going to invoke multiple child RE frameworks. Now, when to use enhanced RE framework? So as I mentioned, so if you have multiple applications involved, so this is one use case that we are seeing over here. The bot is going to read email from the Outlook, and based on the attachment type, it is going to classify that particular email into either invoice or PO. And suppose you have you have to trigger two separate sub process. One is for invoices, you need to post invoices into SAP, or in case of PO, you have to perform some data entry into the Oracle application, right? In those cases, you can use or leverage enhanced RE framework. So this will be going to be your parent RE framework, which is going to be invoking this child RE framework SAP, child RE framework for Oracle part, right? And the best part is each of these child RE framework is going to have its own exception handling, and it is going to keep on retrying if any particular transaction item encounters an exception, right? Same for the Oracle part. The second use case that we are seeing over here is, suppose you are reading an invoice from Outlook, and many a times you will encounter this kind of use case that you also have to extract line items from the invoice, right? And basically in the SAP or in the Oracle, you have to enter those line items and not the only the invoice number, right? So in those cases, you can put a parent RE framework, which is going to fetch the invoices. So you can use one queue for this parent RE framework, which is going to store the invoice file path. At the second step, the SAP process or the Oracle process will be contained inside the child RE framework, which is going to pass, the parent RE framework is going to pass the list of line items by scraping these line items from these invoices. So a list of line items will be passed on to this child RE framework one, which is the SAP subprocess. And each of these line items are going to be inserted in the SAP, right? And in case of any exception encounters in any particular line item, it is supposed to go back to the init state and retry that particular line item, rather than closing it off and going to the end process state. And same, once all these line items are processed in the SAP part, you can sequentially next time call the Oracle process, which is again going to pass the list of line items, and it is going to iterate through each of these line items in this child RE framework, right? So these are the two main use cases. I mean, there will be multiple use cases as well, but these are the two best use cases that you can think of in order to better leverage this enhanced RE framework. Now we were going to jump into the layers of enhanced RE framework. So the details of enhanced RE framework, it has got 4 layers, right? So earlier architecture of standard RE framework, where all these layers were missing. So we are supposed to, in the standard RE framework, there was a framework layer, which was present in the standard RE framework as well, this data layer was also present, but this process layer as well as the services layer was missing, right? Now we have introduced these process layer and services layer. Now what are these? So data layer basically comprises of the config file or any kind of input data files that you are dealing with your process, right? So all those files are going to be contained inside the data folder. Next one is the framework layer. So framework layer basically talks about each of the functionalities of framework. You can well understand the get credentials, get queue max retries, init all settings, which is basically reading from config. You are validating the JSON configurations, right? List of dictionary to data table, taking screenshot. All these are framework related components, right? So in case of exception, all this take screenshot activity will be triggered. In case of initialization, you are going to trigger this init all XAMLs, right? So these are all framework components and comes under the framework layer. So in the process layer, basically, these are the cleanup and prep operations happening. You can see get set transaction data, init all applications, cleanup and prep, close all applications. So these are all application related XAML files or any kind of process that you are invoking, like for SAP or the Oracle, right? You can create multiple subfolders inside this process layer and store the XAML files over there, like log into SAP, doing some data entry into SAP, right? You can store each of those XAML files in this process layer. Next one is the services layer. So services layer is the component or the layer where your child RE frameworks are stored. So in the first case, it offers these four main components of child RE frameworks. Like one is the first run, second one is the get data, and then comes the task one or task two. So these task one or task two comes under the process transaction state, while first run is invoked in the init state, and get data is invoked in the get transaction data state. Now, when are you going to use each of these? So first run, you can well imagine that this is going to be a dispatcher logic, right? So you can contain your dispatcher, whatever, adding to orchestrator queue, adding of transaction items into orchestrator queue. You can perform all those steps in the first run. Second one is the get data. So like the use case we were talking about earlier, you need to extract some line items from invoice as well, right? So one is the first run you have already triggered. That is basically storing each of the invoices into orchestrator queue. Second one is the get data you can leverage in that case in order to extract the line items for a particular invoice. So basically for each of the transaction item, if you want to fetch some additional data from any kind of application, from any kind of document, you can do those operations in the get data child RD framework, right? And task one and task two, basically you can think of these can be leveraged as SAP or Oracle, whatever sub processes you have. You can invoke this task one and task two for that. You can rename this task one and task two into SAP or Oracle, whatever you feel like, right? But going through the components of this services layer, so you can see this is the first run. So each of these child RE frameworks contains these two layers mandatorily, right? One is the data layer and another one is the process layer. Framework layer comes under this. Only these are the framework layers you are having under the parent workflow. But for the child RE frameworks, for all each of these child RE frameworks, you are going to have one is the data layer and another one is the process layer. And this is the main.xaml file. You can see for each of these child RE frameworks, main.xaml file is present. Basically, you have to invoke, in order to invoke this child RE frameworks, you need to invoke this main.xaml files and not process transaction, which is residing in the process layer, right? So process layer also will be having some kind of XAML-like process transaction. But in order to leverage the full uh, functionalities of enhanced RE framework, you need to trigger the main.xaml file, right? So these are the layers of enhanced RE framework. Next, another concept in enhanced RE framework that was introduced is work block concept, right? So work block is nothing but your enhanced RE framework as a whole is the work block, right? So a typical work block consists of three stages. One is the startup phase, second is the process step, and the logging successful stage. So startup phase, basically it consists of any kind of logging mechanism, like from which parent work block it has been called, right? And from which work block it has been invoked. And if you need to print any kind of log messages at the start of this process, you can call those or initialize those variables in this startup phase. In the process step, you need to design your business code over here. And in case of logging successful, you can print the log messages relevant to that particular process. And if any kind of exception is encountered, it basically rethrows that particular exception into the parent work block, right? So this is the template of work block. As a best practice, it is always suggested to pick up this work block template and build your own XAML files, right? So if you have to build your own XAML file, like for login to SAP, you can pick up this template and do all the login steps in this process transaction step, because it already contains an exception handling mechanism to rethrow this particular exception to the parent work block. And even it also contains some inbuilt log activities, which was missing earlier. Earlier, you have to build a separate own sequence or a separate own XAML files, and you have to put all these logs, which many a times we used to miss that from which parent work block this particular work block has been invoked, right? So this is the best part of work block. Now we are moving on to the transaction flow in Enhanced REFramework, right? So we were talking about concepts and details, but not going into the depth of this Enhanced REFramework. This is the overall architecture. So on the left-hand side, what you are seeing over here is the parent REFramework, right? And on the right-hand side, this yellow entire block consists of your services layer, which comprises of all these child REFrameworks. One is the first run task, get data task, task one, and task two. So you can understand each of these are separate own child framework on its own, right? So how the transaction flow happens over here. So in the init state, you are basically, it basically invokes the first run task. This is basically invoked only once. In case of exception, your dispatcher logic won't be invoked. So it basically checks the config parameter for, you have certain settings to be made in the config file in order to invoke this first run task, right? And it takes IO transaction data as input, and it throws out IO transaction data as output, right? And you can build your own dispatcher logic over here. So as far our use case was concerned, like for getting separate transactions from a particular invoices, right? You are reading from emails and storing those invoices in the orchestrator queue. So you can build all those logic in the dispatcher part, right? So all the invoices will be stored in the orchestrator queue. Now, once it does that, it is going to move into the get set transaction data state, where this get data task will be invoked. So get data task, while invoking get data task, you will be having nothing over here. I mean, you can pass the invoice number from that, but the idea of the get data task is basically you are extracting the line items from that particular invoice, and it will basically pass IO transaction data, list of data rows, which basically means list of the line items from that particular invoice, right? So once it does that, it is going to pass back to the get set transaction data state. It is also going to get the particular invoice. With that particular invoice as transaction item, it is going to invoke the process transaction state over here. And from the process transaction state, you are basically invoking the task one and task two, right? And what you are passing as an argument, you are passing the list of data rows which you have scrapped in the get data task over here, right? So you are basically passing this IO transaction data in this task one. And with this list of line items from this parent work block, it is basically invoking the task one. And over here, you can also build your own orchestrator queue for storing each of these line items in the orchestrator queue, right? So you can you can add those line items into orchestrator queue in the init block. Once it does that, it is going to move into the get set transaction data state and fetch each of the line items and pass those line items into the process transaction state. Here, you're basically, your entire SAP operations or any application specific operations will be happening. So as you can understand, you are basically encountering or catching each of the exceptions or success and retrying each of these line items in case of exception as well, right? So once all the line items for that particular invoice is processed successfully, it is going back to the end process state. You can close the SAP application in the end process state over here. And once it does that, it is going back to the process transaction state. And again, with the same IO transaction data, the same list of line items that you had scrapped earlier, it is basically going to invoke the task two, which is basically your another application specific task like Oracle application, right? So here again, you can maintain separate orchestrated queue for storing all these invoice line items for the Oracle processing. And you can traverse through each of the line items, and exception handling will be automatically handled within this framework itself, right? And once all the line items are processed successfully, it is supposed to go back to the process transaction state once again. And it is again going back to the get set transaction state if it is successful. And again, for the next invoice, it is going to trigger the get data task, which is basically scrapping the line items from the next invoice, which you had put in the orchestrator in the dispatcher logic, right? So it is again going to scrap the line items from the next invoice. And again, the same logic is going to happen over here. It is going to pass the invoice number as transaction item or invoice details. And it is going to pass the list of line items from this process transaction state. And again, each of the line items will be processed over here, and exception handling will be automatically handled within this child RE framework, right? So this is the entire transaction flow of enhanced RE framework. So I would like to pause for a few seconds before moving on. Just want to understand if you have any understood this till this part, right? You can comment yes if you have understood. Or if you have any questions, you can note down the questions we will be addressing at the end of the session, right? Because we are also going to see a use case demo where you are going to understand. So can we expect some ping if you have understood till this part? Okay, I'm getting yes. So this is the entire architecture of enhanced RE framework. Let's move on to the next slide. So what are the additional features we are getting over the standard RE framework? So this is the init state retry, which we earlier had talked about, right? Error recovery part of the init state. Next one is the abort on max consecutive errors for each of the states, init and process transaction, which was missing earlier. So even for the init state, we have error abort mechanism. It is going to retry till a particular max consecutive retry number is reached. And it is going to, if that number is reached, it is going to pass back to the end process state, right? Third one is the work block concept. So as I mentioned earlier, it has got its own startup log, process successful log, and your entire process is going to be happening in the middle, and it is going to catch the exceptions and do the logging mechanism as well, right? So this work block concept has been introduced in the enhanced RE framework. You also have got more options to read the config settings from a JSON file as well. So as I was showing earlier, that you have some XAML files related to validate the JSON file and to read from a JSON file the config settings. So in case of a use case where you don't want to store the config parameters in the Excel file and you want to go ahead with the config.json, something of that sort, you can leverage this functionality, right? Next one is it combines the dispatcher and performer workflows into a single RE framework, right? And this was missing earlier. You have to build your own dispatcher logic, performer logic, and those were not basically RE framework itself, and you have to build your own exception handling mechanism, so which was missing earlier. It has also introduced a fixed system reserved variables. I will be talking more about the system reserved variables while we go into the project, but basically idea of the system reserved variables is it basically stores some parameters related to the framework, like for transaction number, retry number, max retry number, init state retry number. All those parameters are going to be stored in this system reserved dictionary. And you don't need to maintain separate variables for each of those parameters, right? Because those are basically framework components and should be system reserved. And users should not create additional variables with related to the framework components, right? I will be talking more about this, but yeah, this is the idea of the system reserved components. It also allows easy migration or integration from RE framework. Like for an use case, if you have a SAP RE framework already implemented, right, you can go ahead with the integration of that standard RE framework into this enhanced RE framework, so that you can leverage the full functionalities of enhanced RE framework, and you can invoke other Oracle process. You can reuse the RE framework you have built earlier for another process in this enhanced RE framework itself, right? So you don't have to build from scratch. So it also has the exception handling at the end process state of each of the task under service layer. So we will be going into the details of this. So basically idea of this is if any kind of abort scenario is happening over here, it basically throws the exceptions that at which state that exception was encountered, right? Like whether it was encountered in the init block, whether it was encountered in the get set transaction data state or in the process transaction data state, right? It also does some logging mechanism and throws those kind of errors so that you can leverage those kind of informations in your logging mechanism as per audit trail. Now, what are the best practices that you can follow in case of enhanced REFramework? One is the work block template that we talked about earlier, right? Whenever you are building any kind of standalone workflows, like specific to some applications, you need to copy that work block template and rename that work block template and build your own logic over there, right? You just need to tweak some parameters like what is the work block name over there, and automatically the logging will be happening, like from which parent work block that work block has been triggered, and in case of any exception, it is going to do a detailed logging mechanism as well, right? Next one is, in case of you are building any kind of login workflows for your task 1 or task 2 specific applications, you need to put that login XAML inside your process layer of the task 1. I will be talking more about this in detail, but the basic idea of this is, since you are invoking the child RE frameworks, right? In case of any exception, it is supposed to come back to the init state, right? So like for an example of this SAP subprocess, right? In case of any exception, you are supposed to go back to the init block. And again, in that case, you are already closed that application in case of any system exception, right? You need to log in once again. So for that reason, you need to put that login XAML file inside this init block, right? And same for this task too. So this was the idea behind it. The next part is assets or credentials which are relevant for a particular task should be stored inside the data or config file inside the services layer of the task folder. The same idea applies over here. Since you are invoking init state for each of these separate sub-processes, you need to read the config file or store the assets or credentials inside that particular config file of that particular subtask, right? All standalone workflows for a particular process or application should be mentioned inside the process layer. So yeah, this I was talking earlier that the process layer of the main work block, there you need to build your own folder structure for each of the sub processes you want to build, like for SAP or Oracle, right? And not inside the child RE framework. And you also need to always need to invoke the main.xaml file while invoking the task from the services layer, right? These were a couple of best practices. Now we are going to move into the use case demo. But before moving into the use case demo, I would like to walk you through the enhanced RE framework. So how you can get that enhanced RE framework, right? So if you open UiPath Studio, in the templates, you will see an option of enhanced RE framework, right? So if you go down over here, this is the enhanced RE framework, right? You need to click on that. You need to create enhanced RE framework. And once it opens, I will walk you through the project folder structure and as well as some of the details which I had told that I will be guiding you through. So if you open the main XAML, this is the main work block that you are seeing over here. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the main work block. So everything is a work block concept over here. And since it is a work block concept, your entire RE framework is inside the process state that you were seeing earlier. And it has got 3 components: startup, RE framework, and the logging successful mechanism. And this entire work block is encapsulated within a try catch. And basically you are catching any kind of exception and doing the logging details, right? So this is the entire main work block. And if you open the project directory, this is what it looks like, right? This is the data layer that I had talked about earlier, data layer of the parent work block, right? And here you are having input files. Here you are going to store output files, any kind of temporary files you can store over here. Let us go through the config file. So in config file, you have got some additional details as compared to the standard RE framework, right? So this task worksheet was earlier missing. So this enhanced RE framework has introduced this task worksheet, and Each of these settings is available over here, right? So you can see the first run. So you can store the flag value over here. So if you want to invoke the first run, you need to change this flag to 1. So in order to enable the first run. So if you want to invoke any dispatcher logic, right, you just need to change this value to 1. Similarly, for the get transaction or the get data services layer, if you have any use case to extract some line items from a particular invoice, it can have 3 values, right? One is the disable part. First one is the enable only during first run. That is again some kind of dispatcher logic if you want to invoke. And second one is always enable. Always enable means it is going to be triggered for each of the transaction items that you have uploaded into orchestrator queue, right? So you need to change all these settings. And similarly for the task 1 and task 2, you have to maintain this kind of variable. So if you in future, if you want to introduce task 3 over here, right, you can invoke or change this setting in the config file mentioning the path, like for which folder it is belonging, like services layer / task 3, right? The credentials works, it remains the same. In the settings, you have to mention the orchestrator queue name. And over here, you are going to store all these assets relevant to the parent work block and not the child work blocks, right? So this was from the config file. Now let us move into the framework layer. These are the framework inbuilt components that we are having, which is relevant for a particular framework. Init all settings and all these things are stored in the framework layer. If we go down to the process layer, it comes with some inbuilt XAML files like init all applications, get set transaction data, closing all applications, cleanup and prep. You can create multiple subfolders inside this process layer, like for SAP, like for Oracle, and store your individual XAMLs inside this process layer. For services layer, these are the 4 components that we talked about earlier. The first run, get data, task 1, and task 2, right? So each of these has its own main.xaml file. Now, let us go through step by step inside each of these blocks. So in the init state, you are having this, in the system result part, you will be seeing the first run main.xaml getting invoked, which is the first child RE framework over here. And when it is invoked, it is basically invoked in case the transaction number is 1. It is also checking if the retry number is 0. That means if the retry number gets incremented, it is not going to be invoked, right? In case of any retries, first run XAML will never be invoked. Same for the task 1. It is also checking in the config file whether you have task 1 enabled or not. Now going back to the parent RE framework, you have the get data layer over here. So if we come down, you can see the get data main.xaml is invoked whenever orchestrator stop signal is nothing, right? And what is the condition it is checking? Same, retry number should not be greater than 0. It should be always equal to 0. And in the config file, you have to enable this particular task to enable key equals to 2. And you can also change those settings, right? As I mentioned earlier, in case of task to enable is 2, it is always going to be invoked. If the task to enable is 1, it is going to be invoked only once. And if the task to enable is 0, it is never going to be invoked, right? So those conditions are being checked over here. Once the get data services is invoked, here you are basically invoking or getting the uh, particular invoice from the orchestrator queue. This is the inbuilt XAML files that used to come earlier as well. Get set transaction data. Now, if we go back to the parent RE framework once again, here in the process transaction state, you will be seeing in the process transaction XAML file, you will be seeing task 1, or you can, this is not currently invoked over here. This is up to us. You can invoke your task 1 and task 2 over here, right? Just you need to be mindful that you need to invoke task 1 main.xaml and not any other components. And similarly for task 2, if you want to invoke, you need to invoke the main XAML file of the task 2, right? And here, from here on, it is going to be a child RE framework, same for the task 2. Now let me jump into the use case that we were talking about, right? So this is the use case that we have prepared just for demo purpose. We are going to do a customer onboarding for a particular invoice. So basically our end goal is we need to post a particular invoice. So we are going to have two files with us. So these are the two files that you are seeing. As part of the process, it is going to have customer data as well as the invoice creation. Now, if you open the invoice creation file, you are going to have all these details, right? So this is one invoice, and second one is this is the invoice. And invoice number we have to create dynamically based upon the timestamp. So inv hyphen based upon the timestamp, we are going to concatenate random number. We are only going to create the invoice number, and we are going to upload that or type into that invoice number in the application itself, right? But before that, we also have to check whether this customer number already exists in the application or not. And for that, we are going to have this customer data file. So we are going to look up this customer name over here, and based upon the email, we are going to look up that customer email in the application, whether this email exists or not. And if it does not exist, it is also going to create this particular customer. And once the creation is successful, it is going to move ahead with the invoice creation part. So all those steps are mentioned over here. So what are we seeing over here? We are going to log into this particular website. Let me walk you through the application once. This is just for demo purpose, right? If we log into this application, this is the application we are seeing. And in order to create one invoice, we have to go to add invoice button. And here we are going to select the customer. Now, as you can see, you are getting some customer names from the dropdown. So if the customer name does not exist in this database, we have to basically create one customer going back to the customer list. Here, we are going to search by email. Suppose we are searching this particular email over here. If we don't find any records over here, we are getting a particular match, right? But if we don't find any particular match over here, we are going to go ahead and add new customer. And these are the details which will be fetched from the customer data file over here. All these details are stored over here, right? And once we click on add user, that user will be created. And then we can go ahead and create the invoice over here. We are going to select the customer name from this dropdown over here. All these fields will be auto-populated. We are going to pass a dynamic invoice number over here. We are going to pass billing date as today's date. Due date is going to be today's date plus 14 days. Status is going to be coming from the Excel file that we were seeing earlier. Status is going to be this one. And product description, we are going to paste this entire products column over here. Quantity we already have in this particular worksheet. Price, discount is going to be pasted over here. Tax is going to be 18% fixed. And once we do all those data entry, we are going to save invoice. Now, once we click on save invoice, this screen will open up. And from here, we need to scrape this invoice amount and put it over here. So total amount will be going to be invoice amount, and invoice number will be the number that we are generating on runtime, and comment we have to pass it as invoice creation successful or something of that sort, right? So this is the use case. And how we have splitted the use case is the customer onboarding part will be going to be our task one, and the invoice creation part, we are going to store it in the task two, right? And this is how we are going to design the framework. And already I have created the all this designing part. I will be just going to walk through each of the changes that I have made once I have invoked this, right? So as you can see over here in the process layer, we have created two separate subfolders, right? One is the create customer, and second one is the invoice creation. So only one XAML will be enough for creating the invoice, as we are just doing data entry operations. And in the creating of customers, we are going to store each of these, like navigate to home, navigate to customers list, search the customer email. If it does not exist, we are going to create customer, we are going to add new customer, right? So this is how we have designed the process layer. And let us go through the config. Okay, but before that, these are the steps we have drafted. So once we start working on any use case, right? So first of all, we have to update the config files. So as part of config file, we have designed the task like this. So first run will be invoked. We have enabled this first run. We don't need to extract any additional details for a particular transaction item. Hence, we have disabled this get data service layer, and our task one and task two are this, right? And all the assets relevant to the parent RE framework is stored over here, right? Like website URL, customer file path, bot output full path, all these details are stored over here. Now, once we update the config file, what is the next step? We are going to place the business data Excel file in the required folders. So these are the Excel files I already have. So we have put the Excel files in this particular folder, invoice posting process. So, and it is also going to store the bot output over here. So if you see, output report is currently blank, and this is the output report template that we are seeing over here. It is going to contain invoice number, total amount, comment. So we have prepared the business data Excel file over here, and all these file paths are stored in the config, right? Once we do that, our next step is creating of dispatcher logic in the services layer. The first run inside the process layer of get set transaction data.xaml, right? So we have to go ahead and create the dispatcher. So how we have created the dispatcher is, if you go down, this is the first run main.xaml. We are invoking the first run main.xaml, and the condition is we are checking the config settings over here. That is transaction number 1, retry number should be 0, init retry number should be 0, and system task 1 should be enabled, right? And what are the arguments we are passing? We don't have to pass any arguments over here because entire operation will be done in the dispatcher logic itself, right? If we go down, or if we go back to the child RE framework of the first run, this is again a work block concept, and this entire process is a RE framework, right? And the init, and in the init state, we are basically doing the cleanup operations, and then we are going on to close applications. And here in the business process layer interface, we are basically reading the invoice file path, right? Taking from the config. And we are iterating through each of the line items of the invoice and adding to collection. And this is the transaction data that gets populated with the line items of the invoice, right? And after loading this transaction data, we are basically going back to the get set transaction data state. Over here, we are basically iterating or fetching each of the transactions from the get set transaction XAML, right? So here we are basically iterating through each of the, okay, so let me put it through. So in the init block, we haven't uploaded all those queue items in the orchestrator queue, okay? We are just doing it using collection of data rows, right? And as a result of which, we are basically importing each of these parameters over here. So IO transaction item, IO transaction data. So we already have transaction data loaded up in the init block, and we are passing that transaction data from here. And transaction item is currently blank, right? And we are going to load the transaction item from this workflow. So here we are checking if the transaction number is less equal to transaction data count or not, and we are loading the transaction item from here. And if this number is less, we are ending the process over here, marking it as transaction item is nothing. So once we do that, our transaction item is loaded, and we are just adding those items in the orchestrator queue in the process transaction state, right? So here we did not need to do all this complicated logic, but just wanted to show you that it might happen that you are logging into some application and then scrapping some data out of it, right? So in that case, it would be better if you go by this RE framework logic in the first run task itself, right? Where you are basically iterating through each of these invoice line items and basically uploading that into orchestrated queue. So tomorrow, if you have any kind of application from where you might have to fetch some invoices, then you can do that in this process transaction and get set transaction data state, right? So each of these line items will be processed and by iterating through the transaction data, right? So once all the items are loaded into orchestrated queue, it is going to pass back to the end process state, and it is supposed to go back to the parent workflow, which we were seeing earlier. So in the parent workflow, it is going to come back over here. We don't need IO transaction data because as part of the first run task, we have already uploaded those into orchestrated queue. Now our next task is to logic for getting the next item, right? We have created the dispatcher logic. Now the logic is to iterate through each of the items that we have uploaded into orchestrated queue. Now going back to the RE framework, in the get set transaction data state, here we are going to get each of the transaction items. Now, as you know, we are not using get data services layer over here because we have set the parameter as 0 in the config file. Hence, this workflow or get data main workflow won't be invoked over here. We are straight away going to the get set transaction data state, where it is basically getting that particular transaction item, right? Here it is basically getting the transaction item. Once it does that, it is going to pass this transaction item to the process transaction state. Now this new transaction item is already loaded now. It is going to trigger this process transaction state of the main workflow, right? So we have identified the logic for getting the next item. Now our next task is to call our task 1 or task 2 in the main process transaction. So we need to be mindful that main.xaml needs to be invoked over here. Under where? Under the process transaction XAML of the main workflow. So if we open this process transaction XAML, here you will see, okay, so in the process transaction, if you open the arguments, right, you will be seeing IO transaction number, transaction item is there, and transaction number is also there, right? But in order to invoke the task 1 or task 2, we need to pass transaction data, right? Remember this architecture. So what we were passing in the task 1 or task 2, we were passing IO transaction data and not transaction item, right? So currently we only have transaction item, but for our use case, we are basically converting that transaction item into transaction data. So that's why we are basically adding it to collection, and we are loading this transaction data. So currently it is going to contain only one transaction item since we are dealing with only single transaction inside this. We need to pass this transaction data to this task1 main.xaml file. So if you see, this is the list of queue items, which is only going to contain one queue item, that is the transaction item, and it is going to be invoked. It is going to be invoking the main XAML of task1. Now, if I open this main XAML of task1, we again have a child RE framework and again the work block concept, right? And each of these has got its own error recovery part. In the init state, okay, so we have basically performed these two steps, right? Import arguments also we have done, right? Now the part is we are going to build logic for getting the next item in task 1 and task 2 get set transaction data, right? We don't have to initialize anything. Okay, so we have to initialize the application in the under task 1, right? So that login workflow, we are putting it under init all applications. But apart from that, we don't need any kind of dispatcher workflow over here, right? So as a result of which, and we are to move into the get set transaction data state, where we are basically have written some logic to get the transaction item out of the transaction data. So we are checking over here, along with should not stop activity, we are also checking that transaction number should be less equal to transaction data count, right? Once we do that, we are invoking the get set transaction data over here. And if not, we are just initializing it, the transaction item to nothing. right? And once we load this transaction item over here, we are getting transaction item as a output argument, right? Which is the queue item. Only one single queue item will be there. And we are passing that IO transaction item to the process transaction state. And here we are basically checking the queue max retries, and then we are invoking the process transaction XAML of the task one. And here we are going to contain each of these activities. That is, we are going to invoke this create customer XAML, which is going to have all the logics for checking the customer and creating the customer. I'm not going through each of those details, but it is basically loading the customer file path. It is going to navigate into customers list. It is going to search for the customer email. If not email exists, it is going to invoke add new customer email, right? So these are the workflows we have invoked already over here. And once we do that, it is going back to the main XAML over here, right? So one queue item successfully, it checked the customer exist or not. Once it does that, it is going to pass back to the process transaction of the main XAML, where task 2 will be triggered. What was our task 2? Our task 2 was to create the invoice. Now, once the customer is created. So here as well, we are passing the transaction data, that is the list of queue items. And in the get set transaction data of the task 2, we will be having the logic to iterate through each of the queue items. And again, in the init state, we are going to log into this application. Again, in that init block, we are going to log into that application. And yeah, we are also creating the bots output report. And as a result, in our init block, we are reading this output report template, which is going to be a separate template altogether. And once we do that, we are loading the transaction item from the transaction data, which is going to be a single transaction item. And we are going to invoke the process transaction state. And here we have, again, we have some set of XAML files already pre-built, get queue max retries. And after that, it is going to invoking the process transaction XAML over here. And if we go to the process transaction XAML of this task 2 workflow, we are going to see it is going to invoking the invoke create customer, which is again this XAML. And what are the arguments it is passing? It is going to pass the only the transaction item, right? It is passing only the transaction item, some browser variables. It is also extracting the invoice number and invoice amount, which is going to be reported on the output report template. So this is the invoice creation process. Again, navigate to home just for better exception handling. And we are doing all the invoicing adding part over here. And once we do that, we are also outputting the invoice amount, invoice number, scrapping that from the application, and we are passing back to the process transaction XAML. Now, process transaction XAML is again going to output this invoice amount, invoice number to the main XAML of this task 2. And here we are going to populate the output report. So if you see, once each of the transaction item is successful over here, we are basically doing the successful reporting. So we are adding a data row to the output report template that we had already created earlier, and we are appending that particular row item in this bot output report. And in case of any exception, we are also doing some exception handling. So which is going to be in the end process state, right? So here we are going to have all the throw system exceptions, and all the error will be handled over here, right? And once it throws the error, it is going to pass back to the main work block of the parent workflow, and it is going to trigger an email. So now once we have identified this, let's just see the bot in action, right? So let us see if our orchestrator is connected. Yeah. Let me close all browser. I've already shown the bot output report is empty currently, right? And if we run this workflow, Just in order to segregate each of the stages of the bot's workflow, there is a message box in between where it is going to check for the customer name if it exists or not. We will be encountering that message box, right? But you can see that init all settings have started, and now it is going to invoke the first run, which is the dispatcher logic. Currently, it is reading the config file of the main work block. It is killing all applications. Now the first run task execution has been started. It is initializing all applications for the first run task and loading the orchestrator queue. Now first run task has been successfully completed. Now it is going to move ahead into the get set transaction data state, where it is checking the transaction number, transaction data count. You have two invoices in the invoice data file. Currently, it is reading the first transaction number. Now it is loading the transaction item from the orchestrator queue. Now our process transaction state will be invoked over here. And inside the process transaction state, our task 1 and task 2 will be there, right? Okay, so currently it is still in the first run task because it is loading the each of the transaction items into orchestrator queue. That's why you are seeing the two invoices are already loaded in the orchestrator queue. Now it has get set transaction data execution started and process transaction has been triggered. And now you can see task 1 has been started and the control has gone back to the customer creation workflow. So it is going to create or check for a customer name for the first invoice. And if the customer exists, it is going to bypass into invoice creation process. Otherwise, it is going to create a customer and then do the invoice posting. Right now, you can see under task 1 in the init block, it has logged in the application. It is going to navigate into customers list. It is going to search for the email ID of the customer. This is the message box I was talking about. The customer exist has been found, and hence it is going to bypass this process and go into the invoice creation workflow, right? Again, it is going to trigger the login activity once again, and it is going to navigate into invoice list and create the invoice. Let us wait for task 2 to be triggered. Task 2 has been triggered and it is going to log into this application once again. It is typing in the credentials. It is going into invoicing system and it is going to click on the add invoice button. And it is going to select the customer name from the dropdown, typing in all these details and going to save this particular invoice, right? Now, once it saves, it is also going to look up for the invoice amount. Now it has filtered this invoice number. It has extracted the invoice amount. Now it is going to move ahead to the next invoice. And for the next invoice, again, task 1 and task 2 will be triggered, right? So for the next invoice, again, it is going to extract and check the customer email, whether it exists in the application or not. If it does not exist, it is going to create this customer, and then it is going to move ahead with the invoice creation part. As you can see, task 1 execution has been started. It is going to log into the application once again. It is going to customers list once again and check for the customer name. Let us see if it finds or not. Now this email does not exist. Since we have element exist activity, it is waiting for a timeout and then it is going to pop up. Yeah, customer exist false. It is going to create the customer. It is going to click on add new customer. It is going to add the details of the customer and going to add this particular customer over here. Now, once adding of customer is successful, it is going to trigger the next workflow, that is a task 2, which is the invoice creation workflow. Since this was a single application, it was not needed to log in and log out every time. But I wanted to demonstrate it, like for an example, tomorrow, if you have two separate applications, this is the way you should proceed. You should have a separate login activity at the init block. And for each of the transactions, you should close the SAP or Oracle, whatever applications is involved, right? It is logging into the application. It is going back to the invoicing system. It is going to create the invoice. Add new invoice, selecting the customer, entering all these details from the invoice file. It is going to save the invoice. It is going to extract the invoice amount. Once it is successful, it has extracted the invoice amount. At the end of the process, we are going to receive an email as well, right? So if we go back, we haven't yet received any email from the bot, but we can definitely check out this output report. As you can see, the two line items have been successfully posted. It has successfully extracted the invoice number, invoice amount. And for the second one, as you understand, the customer was successfully created, even if it didn't exist, right? And this is the email that we were looking for. And if we open the attachment, the two line items have been successfully posted, right? So this is an end-to-end demo kind of thing we wanted to showcase. So yeah, let me go back to the presentation. I think we are almost to the end of this session. I would be just looking up for any kind of questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dibajiti, for all the demonstration and all the theoretical part for Enhanced RE framework. And I obviously believe that it will help all of us for future use cases as well. And if anyone is using Enhanced RE framework right now as well, so he or she can get any insights from your presentations, your theory, and the demonstration as well. So thank you so much for the voiceover as well, what you have given during the processing of the bot. So yeah, so we have one question here. So the question was asked by Progesh. So he's saying that any different variable name used from old and new framework.
From variable naming conventions, okay, I just need to showcase you one thing which I missed out, which I promised earlier that I will be showcasing, right? Uh, you can see the same kind of variable naming conventions is present. Only difference is you can see work block. Since we are going with the work block architecture or work block template, this is the work block path, name, start time, and end time, or browser, right? So these arguments are being passed to individual child work blocks as well in order to log the exceptions, right? But yeah, if we go into the variable sections, the same variable naming conventions still exist. Like earlier, you used to see transaction item. Transaction item exists as queue item, or you can use data row. That will be totally fine. You can tweak with this variable type. But transaction data is, again, it is going to be a collection of transaction items. Accordingly, you can change this variable type. But all these details, config, system error, are the same variable naming conventions we are following over here. And one thing I wanted to show you, that is the system reserved part. System reserved, this is the dictionary that Enhanced RE framework has introduced. It consists of is queue item flag, transaction number, retry number, init retry number, continuous retry number, and robot failure, right? So all these values are getting stored inside the system reserved. So you don't need to create any kind of additional variables for each of these. So even though earlier you used to have transaction number as a separate variable, but now you need to use the system reserved variables. Now, let me go to the step where it is basically setting all these. So if you go to this process transaction, right, in the transition state, whenever it is successful, if you go into this transition state, you are saying that each of these variables are being set over here. Transaction number is getting incremented, retry number is being initialized, and continuous retry number is also being initialized. Only change is this system defined or system reserved dictionary. Apart from that, whatever variables you used to follow earlier, the same variable naming conventions are being followed in this enhanced RE framework. So that allows seamless integration into any kind of RE framework that you are going to follow.
Okay, so Pragesh, so you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I
So
can,
and
you can,
please,
yeah,
yes,
yeah, yeah.
yes, and
That will
everyone
be
can
better.
unmute yourself. Yes, and please, please
Don't,
interact with our speaker. So
right. I
and
would
please,
suggest
please
go one by
let
one.
us know. Sure. And before that, I would like to know from Pragesh. So does that answer meet your question expectation,
Pragesh, just you can unmute
Pragesh?
yourself.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I
Okay,
got my
okay.
answer.
Yeah, you can ask any additional questions you have. Yeah, if you are asking that to share the code, I can share this code with you.
Okay, sir.
So you will be finding that in the UiPath community page only, where
Mm.
the recording is going to be present. Okay.
Okay, sir. Can you tell me how many tasks to be added in this workflow?
So from task perspective, you can add multiple tasks, right? Currently, we are seeing only task one and task two. You can also have only task one, and within that task one, you can also integrate other tasks as well, depending upon your use case, right? But that's totally up to you. You can tweak this enhanced RE framework like you used to do earlier with the standard RE framework version as well, right?
Oh,
Like
okay.
you used to build separate XAML files. Here also you can build your own task and own use case specific task, right? You can
Yeah,
also rename those tasks one,
you are mentioning only two tasks, but I want to
right?
add more tasks. Means
Yeah,
where
you
I
can definitely,
mention the add more child framework in this
right,
main parent child work
right,
framework.
right. So
Okay.
that you can do over here, right? So I was already going through the project folder structure. So yeah, here you are having only task one and task two, right? You just need to copy this particular folder and rename and create again another task three. And the same template is going to be followed over there as well, right?
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions we are having?
Okay, so one question has asked from Jan Go that can you share another use case?
Yeah, so I already talked about two use case where you are going to use enhanced RE framework, right? So in any kind of complicated scenarios where you are going to deal with multiple transactions inside RE framework, not the conventional transaction items, but yeah, if you have multiple transaction labels for individual transaction items, then you can definitely go ahead with this enhanced RE framework. But yeah, in case of any kind of simple use case where you are dealing with only single transaction item, we would suggest to go ahead with the standard RE framework. Again, this is not a kind of replacement for the standard RE framework. It is just an enhanced version of the standard RE framework. That's what you can see over here, right? So we are not suggesting any kind of replacement of the standard RE framework, but it is just a kind of integration of your standard RE framework use cases if you have any. Does that answer you, John? Go. You can unmute yourself and you can interact. So anyone can unmute and talk. I would like to interact more, right? So
Yeah, sure. So definitely. So anyone is having any question, so please unmute yourself and speak to our speaker. Okay, and it will definitely help us to interact, and we will definitely encourage this. So anyone having any question, so please unmute and speak.
yeah, right. So we can definitely have other use cases as well, and we can definitely talk about those. But yeah, we would like to know from you what are the kind of use cases that you are looking for so that we can uh, design those in the upcoming community sessions, right? Okay, Pragesh is asking to share the community page. Apurva, can you share the our community Kolkata page with
Sure.
Prakash? Yeah.
Sure.
I
I'll
think it has
definitely.
already been shared, Rohit, but yeah.
Yeah, sure. So actually, I was thinking to do these things at the last. So definitely, I am sharing the link. So you can please go and join our community, community chapter Kolkata. Okay.
Just let me know. I mean, just give a smiley or reactions that if this session was helpful or not, right? I would like to understand. Or you can also suggest if any improvements are required in the upcoming sessions. We are definitely open for feedback. We are going to have a meetup as well, right? Okay. Thanks, John Go. Okay. Okay. So Suresh is asking how to decide between standard or enhanced RE framework based upon use case, right? So to give you a better picture, like suppose you have a use case where you are dealing with uh, one. So I talked about two use cases, right? In a generic way, any kind of multiple applications, if you have in your particular process, you can go with enhanced RE framework, right? Where you can integrate each of those separate sub processes or sub applications into your standard RE framework and integrate the same in the enhanced RE framework, right? One is that use case where you are having multiple applications. Second use case can be one transaction item if it contains multiple other subline items, right? In that case, you can proceed with enhanced RE framework because there, if you use standard RE framework, you are going to use or leverage only the standard facilities that it is having. That is only the linear flow of transactions are going to happen. And you need to do the additional exception handling for each of the line items that you process, right? So in that case, if you use the enhanced RE framework version, that will be helpful in capturing each of the exceptions and log the exceptions accordingly, right? Does that answer, Suresh Patra? You can unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Rakesh is saying need more explain, more use case integrated to logic. Okay. So Prakesh, we already talked about one use case. I will be sharing the use case code with you as well. So you can go through the uh, workflows, how that workflows has been structured. But again, if we go on talking about use case, it is going to be an endless topic. But yeah, if we have some relevant use cases to talk about and we can plan ahead of time, right? The basic idea is to create an awareness about enhanced RE framework because what I see in the industries is RE framework is recognized as a standard, but even in case of complicated scenarios, we try to tweak the RE framework or the standard RE framework, uh, which does not give us the full benefits, right? In those cases, if we leverage or suggest the client to go with the enhanced RE framework version, that will be really robust automation we can build where we can integrate our own exception handlings, and even the framework has its own exception handling and do the has the logging capability, right? I think we are well ahead of time. The session was till 12, but yeah, we can talk more, we can interact more.
Yes, sure,
If you want
definitely.
any specific topic to discuss some specific topic in upcoming community sessions, we can definitely do that. But yeah, we need to have your feedback as well.
Yeah, Dibajati. So Ajashri is saying that in standard RE framework, when max consecutive exception came into peak, in case want to retry, what is the best practice?
In standard RE framework, when max consecutive exception come into the picture, in case we want to retry, what is the best practice? Yeah, in the standard RE framework, you already have that kind of mechanism where it is basically checking the retry count and doing the retry, right? But you can leverage the same logic which is implemented in the enhanced RE framework, right? Basically, it is nothing. It is basically checking for the abort for each of the steps if the consecutive retry count has been reached or not, right? So the same logic can be helpful in building your own logic in the standard RE framework as well, right? So does that answers your question, Ajasvi? Let me share my screen if that helps. How the consecutive retry is happening in case of enhanced RE framework. Ajasvi, you can just unmute yourself, right? So this is the error recovery part that we are seeing, right? And it is basically checking for max continuous retry number. And it is also checking by incrementing the continuous retry number, whether it has reached the maximum continuous retry number or not. And accordingly, it is incrementing the continuous retry number. And again, system reserved variables are being used over here. And it is incrementing the transaction number, right? And after incrementing the transaction number, it is flowing into the same standard RE framework concept where you are basically retrying with the and going ahead with the next transaction, and retry will automatically handled by the orchestrator queue, right? So same if we go into the
Hi.
error. Yeah, hi.
Yeah. Hi. Hello. Actually, I'm very new to this path, and I'm learning the RE framework now only. So I'm going only learning to standard RE framework. So I have one question. Like when we are saying about a retry in queue, we have in a queue, like if you specify 1, 2, or 3, will that mechanism will return that much times. Okay, so we have something like in a config, like maximum consecutive exception number is there. So if you give this something number over there, so which number it will take? So from the orchestrator queue or from the config file?
Okay, let me go back to the standard RE framework. Let me open it. Okay,
yeah,
I will show you the config file over there. Yeah, this was the question we asked in the quiz as well, right? So how it happens is, if you see in the config file, the description itself says that if you are using orchestrator queue, right? I'll just give me a moment. Let me open the RE framework. So if you are using orchestrator queue, then by default, you need to set that max retry in the config file to 0. But if not, then you can go ahead with any number that you are planning to do in the config file, right? But it is always recommended when you are going with orchestrator queue to always go with the retry mechanism of orchestrator queue, right? So, I mean, that is the best practice that we are having. If I open this config file, let me show you. Yeah, this one you're talking about, right? So this flag should always be 0 whenever you are implementing orchestrator queue, right? And orchestrator queue will always have the precedence in that case. But as part of best practice, this flag needs to be changed if you are not going with, or if you are not implementing orchestrator queue. Suppose you are dealing with any Excel automation, or only Excel file needs to be involved in your automation, right? In that case, you can set the config value over here and you can implement the same. But in case of orchestrator queue, this needs to be always 0. This is the recommended best practice, right? And orchestrator queue will always have the precedence over config file.
Okay, and the below one, notice that maximum consecutive system exception is there, right? So if you specify something over there, then what will happen?
Right. So this is to check whether you want to check for consecutive system exceptions or not, right? So as this description says, number of consecutive system exceptions allowed. If max consecutive system exceptions is reached, the job is stopped. To disable this feature, set the value to 0. Suppose you are encountering consecutive exceptions for a set of transactions, right? and the same exception is happening over there. So there, if you see in your standard RE framework, this max consecutive system exception size is being checked, and then only it is going to stop this particular job, right? If I open the standard RE framework, if you see system exception, right? If I go into this block over here, system exception is not nothing.
In initialization state, I think they have given the mechanism, and they over process, like in a system exception, they have increasing the number of.
Yeah. Over here, they're checking all these logics, right? If orchestrator queue is mentioned and queue folder, it is reading all these files, and it is also checking max consecutive system exceptions is exceeded or not, right? So this is just a setting in the config file. This has nothing to do with the orchestrator queue. Orchestrator queue settings does not have any kind of that max consecutive system exceptions, right? This is only getting picked up from the config file. And if you set it to 0, it won't check for any max consecutive system exceptions. If you encounter multiple system exceptions consecutively, it is going to go ahead with the process, right? But if you set this to 1 or 2, let's say, so then it is going to check that whether 1 times or 2 times the bot has encountered the same system exception or not, and then it is going to move ahead into the end process state and not going to the go ahead the get transaction data state, right? So that's how this flag value works.
It is not related to retry mechanism, right?
No.
So it is something.
This is just for, yeah, it is definitely for retrying, but it is checking basically if we encounter a system exception, the same system exception consecutively or not, and accordingly it is going to stop the process.
Okay. I thought if something transaction is a failing and we are trying to retry, so how many times it is retrying, so it is counting that only particular transaction.
Right. No, see, if you see in this condition over here, so it is saying, so if you read the description, max consecutive system exception number was reached and throw the exception to the end process state. So it is basically deciding whether to go back to the end process state or to go back to the get transaction data state, right? So for that, it is checking this particular logic. So many times you will encounter in your automation, right? The same system exception is happening consecutively for a set of transactions. Then you should not actually proceed with the process anymore. The process owner needs to look into the process, what changes might have happened. But yeah, you need to stop the process. So there in this flag value, you have to define whether 2 times or 3 times, if you encounter the same system exception, then you need to abort the process or not, right? So for that, this logic is being used.
Yeah, sure. Got it. Thank you so much for the explanation. Yeah.
Okay, I think
we can also take few more questions within 5 minutes. So if anyone is having any query, so please unmute yourself and speak to our speaker. Anyone, anything? So as we have quite more time, so our end time is 12 IST. So you can go with your basic questions about RE framework as well if you need any help. So Dibit will definitely share his insights on those points. Okay, so I think it's a no. Okay, so no problem. Thank you so much everyone for joining this meetup today. And we are planning in-person meetup in Kolkata. So whoever is in Kolkata, so please keep updated with our community page. I have shared the community page link in this chat box. So please have a look on that. Please join the community if you think that the sessions are valuable, and you can also guide us if you need any help for any other topic. So we will be defining we'll be definitely doing some sessions on based on your suggestions, and please keep in touch, and whoever will be in Kolkata in the next month, so probably we'll be going for 6th August. Okay, so we can definitely join the session, and you will be definitely having mails from the community page itself. So thank you so much everyone for joining today's call, and thank you so much Dibyajyoti for this insightful session, and all the things you have delivered today. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks a lot everyone for joining the session. So looking ahead to have more interactive sessions and more enthusiasm.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thank
day.
you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.